1945, on August 6th, the world realized that with no warnings, they had entered the atomic age. The Americans dropped a single nuclear bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The explosion destroyed over 4 square miles of the center of the city.
90,000 people on the island were killed instantly. The 25,000 who were injured later died in protracted agony from radiation sickness. 3 days later, a second atomic strike on the city of Nagasaki killed 37,000 people and injured another 43,000, making it a total of 200,000 Japanese civilian dead.
On August 10th, the Japanese government announced its readiness to accept the joint American-British unconditional surrender if the following happened, with the understanding that the said declaration does not compromise any demand which prejudices the prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler.
A day later came the American reply, which included these words: "From the moment of the surrender, the authority of the Emperor and the Japanese government to rule the state shall be subject to the Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers." Then, finally, on August 14th, the Japanese formally accepted the provisions and a ceasefire was announced.
The question that has been plaguing historians for many years was the bomb justified? In this video, we will show you 3 agreements that did not justify the bombing of Hiroshima.
The USA claims they hit a military base in Hiroshima, when in reality the bomb hit mostly civilians. After the bombing, President Truman tried to defend his use of the power of a nuclear weapon. He claimed it saved millions of lives by quickly ending the war. To justify, he then declared, "The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base. That was because we wished in the first attack to avoid, insofar as possible, the killing of civilians." In reality, this statement was ridiculous. Most of the casualties in the bombing were civilians, and in return, the USSBS, United States Strategic Bombing Survey, said that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were chosen as targets because of their concentration of activities and population. This meaning that Truman was lying, and the claim that the bomb was meant for their military base is retorted by the fact that the USA then bombed Nagasaki as well. All the terrible effects on Japan were still nothing though. Most Americans accepted and continued to accept the official justifications for the bombings. Accustomed to crude propagandistic portrayals of the Japs as virtually subhuman beasts, most Americans in 1945 heartily welcomed any new weapon that would wipe out more of the despised Asians and help average the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Then, after the July 1943 firestorm destruction of Hamburg, the mid-February 1945 Holocaust of Dresden, and the fire bombings of Tokyo and other Japanese cities, America's leaders, as U.S. Army General Leslie Groves later commented, were generally inured to the mass killing of civilians. For President Harry Truman, the killing of tens of thousands of Japanese civilians was simply not a consideration in his decision to use the atom bomb.
If the atomic bomb was dropped to impress the Japanese leaders with the immense destructive power of a new weapon, this could have been accomplished by deploying it on an isolated military base. It was not necessary to destroy a large city, and whatever the justification for the Hiroshima blast, it is way much more difficult to defend the second bombing of Nagasaki. The fact that they dropped a bomb on a city that had never been bombed before made a big impression for the Japanese citizens around the whole country. The military reacted as soon as the bomb was dropped by trying to rescue and save all the people that evacuated to the frontiers of the city on top of the mountain. What they didn't know was that the bomb was more lethal than it looked like. First of all, they only knew that the bomb blasted from the center of the city, destroying and incinerated everyone inside. The surprise was that because it was an atomic bomb, it released radiation as an effect to the second blast, expanding through Hiroshima till it reached the frontiers as mountains for its end lakes. The second blast was the worst one because the people that was watching the first explosion absorbed the radiation that was released, making them weak until they died of sickness and pain.
Japan already had been defeated militarily by June 1945. Almost nothing was left of the Navy, and Japan's Air Force had been all but totally destroyed. Against only token opposition, American warplanes ranged at will over the country, and U.S. bombers rained down devastation on her cities, steadily reducing them to rubble. What was left of Japan's factories and workshops struggling fitfully to turn out weapons and other goods from inadequate raw materials. By July, about a quarter of all the houses in Japan had been destroyed, and her transportation system was near collapse. Food had become so scarce that most Japanese were subsisting on a sub-starvation diet. Even before the Hiroshima attack, American Air Force General Curtis Lee May boasted that American bombers were diving the Japanese back to the Stone Age. Henry H. Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, declared in 1949, "It always appeared to us, atomic bomb or no atomic bomb, the Japanese were already on the verge of collapse." This was confirmed by former Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kono, who said, "Fundamentally, the things that brought about the determination to make peace was the prolonged bombing by the B-29s.
The main argument in support of the decision to use the atomic bomb is that it saved American lives, which would otherwise have been lost in true D-Day style land invasion of the main island of the Japanese homeland. The first, against the southern island of Kyushu, had been scheduled for November 1st, called Operation Torch. The second, against the main island of Honshu, would take place in spring of 1946, called Operation Coronet. The two operations combined were codenamed Operation Downfall. There is no doubt that land invasion would have been incurred extremely high in casualties, for a variety of reasons. For one, Field Marshal Hisashi Tauichi had ordered that 100,000 Allied prisoners of war be executed if the Americans invaded. Second, it was apparent that the Japanese, as much as the Americans that were few good landing sites, and Japanese forces would be concentrated there. Third, there was real concern in Washington that the Japanese had made a determination to fight literally to the death. The Japanese saw suicide as an honorable alternative to surrender. The term they used was gyokusei, or shattering of the Geoi cross engraved jelly. It was the same reaction for the so-called banzai charges employed early in the war. In 1944, emergency declaration, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo had called for 100 million gyoseki, and that the entire Japanese population be prepared to die.